Muy buenos días a todos.
Good morning to all of you. We will begin the second day of our Congress of the PPP Analysis and Good Practices Network. This panel is called PPP Units and the optimum links to other government institutions throughout the project lifecycle. We'll have 5 experts on this very important topic. We will discuss the issue of coordination and institutional structure. We will begin with Andrea Rebollo from CAINSA, who will talk about the PPP units and the transformative effects, summarizing the work done by Andres on the institutional change that these units may achieve in enhancing and improving PPP processes in the region. The presentation is planned to last for 20 minutes, after which we will open it up to participation by the panelists, each of whom will be asked 2 questions, which they will reply to for about 8 minutes. A brief introduction of the participants. Maria Susana Morales Loaiza is currently the project director at the private public investment entity Proinversión in Peru. Catherine Sandoval is the director for the infrastructure PPP program in Colombia. Adilio Sere is Vice Minister for Economic Planning and Social Planning in Paraguay. Sigmund Freund is currently Executive Director at the General Office for PPPs in the Dominican Republic, and Andres Cebollo is the founder and General Director of CAIN. We will now listen to Andres Cebollo. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. Yes.
Ahora.
There we go.
Se me resiste un poco, a ver.
It's struggling a bit, but there we go. Thank you very much, Danielle. And thanks to the IDB for having commissioned this research project on central PPP units in Latin America and the Caribbean and their optimum links with other government institutions, with the following subheading: from APP unit with a small u to a central transformative PPP unit. And we will highlight this. What is the rationale underlying this project? There is a clear risk or feeling that there is a lack of awareness as to the complexities and specificities inherent in PPP processes, which, if we look 10, 15 years back, we have a long-standing tradition of public investment, and in Latin America, with planning and public investment management culture, which is truly significant, even compared to other continents. And all of a sudden, PPPs came along, and this should not create a brutal disruption, because after all, these are public investments, but they have specificities in terms of the processes and management cycle, which needs to be taken into account and built into the cycles as part of the public investment system. And there might be a certain lack of awareness as to what needs to be adapted, what is still current and what not so much anymore in terms of public investment processes. And then, of course, there's the general lack of clarity regarding the possible role of a PPP unit, and more specifically, what we know as central PPP units. To what extent are these, or should these be, really new institutions? You see, either you have pre-existing units for example, a certain oversight authority or unit within the Ministry of Finance, but at least it needs to have new capacities. And in that sense, it becomes a new entity. Sometimes it is completely new, brand new, such as the case of the office created in Panama, which is brand new, no doubt. And we must build all of this clearly into the process. So that's the rationale. What is the purpose of the paper? To define how we can make the role of a central PPP unit more effective in better managing PPP projects and programs, especially with regard to process quality assurance, proposing as a secondary objective a process for performance evaluation of the system, and specifically with regard to central PPP units. What do we consider to be one of these central units? It is an organization within the government structure which has skills in the field of PPP, but unlike a specialized team at a ministry, in this case, it gathers capacities for the benefit of the whole government or all of a sector with a focus on quality assurance as regards projects and specifically PPP. The methodology or working approach chosen has been this. In order to get to the point we wanted to reach, we looked at a number of issues based on current literature and also doing our own thinking exercise and based on evidence, focusing on 9 countries in Latin America. We've had some interactions with a number of people through questionnaires and phone calls, in addition to 3 cases from Asia, what we thought would be relevant for benchmarking purposes, in addition to a recent research project with regard to PPP units in EU countries. So what did we look at? The context of the activity of a central PPP unit, which is nothing more than assurance work with regard to good practices, and then the possible functions allocated to a central unit. We created a catalog that is more accurate and narrower in scope. We then looked at the key aspects to ensure the effectiveness of a PPP unit. A clear problem highlighted by literature is that often PPP units are simply very flashy, snazzy teams with human resources, but not necessarily providing effectiveness, not truly groundbreaking in terms of the processes. We then looked, based on literature and our own consideration, at the success and failure factors for PPPs and the key factors in design. The paper also offers a review of institutional frameworks in the 9 countries reviewed. And as part of that, what was the position of the PPP or PPPs, if more than one, and what were the interactions with other actors in the institutional structure? So as to have a comparative approach, again, looking at the PPP frameworks in other countries. And we offered recommendations and guidelines for a design or review process in relation to a PPP. And looking at the specific context, we talked about a responsibility analysis with regard to ensuring good practices. This is a second area of responsibility dealt with in literature. And in this regard, the IDB is especially active. We can talk about 4 areas of responsibility. One related to project implementation. Usually it's a contracting or grantor authority that executes, implements, and supervises the contracts. Then there's the assurance with regard to good practices, quality assurance. Then there's the management of public finance, and a 4th area, which would be project approval. The approval per se of projects should not be mistaken for the PPP central unit role as a gatekeeper which has to somehow cleanse the projects before they reach the final entity, which is often a committee. All of these responsibilities can be taken over by different institutions. All of them may have a small PPP unit, a small U unit, and the key point here is the focus on assurance. And a second side of things we will look at now, again, thinking in terms of the literature, what are the specific components of the quality assurance? We have a definition of policies and guidelines. We have issues related to management of knowledge and capacities with two broad areas. One is training and the other one is advisory services. Then there's the quality control, the gatekeeping, and finally coordination. These two things will be integrated into a single one, quality control and coordination. So these would be the main functions of the central unit. Here we go into greater detail on the 9 countries, looking at their institutional framework and the way they deal with quality assurance. So some of the institutions that we have identified in these countries, by the way, Jamaica is not included here due to the lack of an update. In some cases, we will have institutions that can be classified as a central PPP unit, and some of them also transformative, not all of them. But some other times, it's just a pre-existing unit, just a Ministry of Economy and Finance, or a unit within it, such as in the case of Peru. Based on this, we were able to draw a few conclusions. There is a certain degree of scattering, which is sometimes not unusual, but perhaps not ideal. In Peru, for instance, with regard to review processes, there might be multiple actors within the Ministry of Finance, and we haven't seen them grouped in a specific unit. In Colombia, there are multiple institutional actors that can offer advice. So sometimes there's a duplication of actors, not always, but in a few instances. But the general analysis offers highly positive results because we see a concentration of functions, which is key to the proper functioning of an institutional system as regards ensuring good practices. So we can say then that we have 11 central units within the 9 countries we have looked at. Now, what is the key factor when it comes to effectiveness? Again, trying to define this concept of a central PPP unit with a transformative direction. It is a unit that concentrates knowledge and provides service to all of governments or to a whole sector, but it must also be duly institutionalized, must have an institutional structure and have autonomy and authority. And it must be a central piece in the responsibilities related to assurance and coordination. And the knowledge management function, we think, is rather weak in the region as a whole. There's also the importance of supporting or leading the design of policies. Also, there must be substantial participation in the verification and approvals process, and ideally, it should coordinate in the approvals process, and if possible, and there is no conflict of interest, it should provide advice in developing projects and or programs. But it should issue policies, coordinate, and ensure quality. This creates an economy of scale and boosts the authority, creating a virtuous cycle of enhancing knowledge. The best advisor when it comes to implementing policies is the one who has issued them or who has set about reviewing them. And obviously the one who has come up with the policies or has influenced them or has participated is best placed to offer advice. What about the evidence? Based on a review, out of the 11 units we looked at regarding 9 country cases, which are duly fleshed out in the paper, we generally see a satisfactory degree of concentration, and 7 of the units are transformative. Only 7, which is not too little either. 3 of them with very high leadership and intensity in all 3 functions, such as the one in El Salvador, Proesa, the Technical Planning Office in Paraguay, which is the General PPP Office, and DNP in Colombia, which, it must be said, we are looking at DNP as a whole as a PPP unit, although it is actually a team which doesn't have a strong institutional structure as such, but we are looking at the agency as a whole. So we have 3 that are truly perfect in that they cover all 3 functions. And the other 4 have a significant component. The base focus of the units will vary. It is not unusual when we talk about brand new specific units that are created. There is no central focus because they span all 3 functions, such as Proesa or the general office of the STP agency. But when they are pre-existing units that have been revamped as a specialized team within an already existing agency, they already have a previous focus on advice, for example, the case of Proinversión or the case of the bank in Jamaica. Or in some cases, there's a focus on certain projects, such as in Colombia. There may be a focus on project review, and then they may expand on to providing training and advice, such as the unit in Uruguay or the office within the Ministry of Finance in the case of Paraguay as well, or the case of Mexico as well. What are some of the weaknesses we have identified? A lack of leadership in the training function. And that is one of the issues related to the lack of resources. So often the focus should be more on training rather than on hiring due to the difficulties in paying private sector specialists. Another problem is the shortcomings in resources, but this is a universal problem. The lack of coordination and leadership in the review process. Sometimes there is a lack of proper coordination. Uruguay, Costa Rica, Colombia, cases in point. This is a little colored map with the 3 areas, and the lighter blue is low intensity, the medium blue is intermediate, and then we have the deep blue when you truly have a transformative unit. We also looked at the success factors as well as the failure factors. Very briefly, because we will focus on key factors related to the design of a unit. In order to be effective, a unit should have a proper institutional structure and appropriate autonomy. It should have public support, especially resources allocated to it. It must have effective legal authority, but it must have significant authority of its own. It should have resources, and it must be duly built into the existing architecture. That is absolutely crucial. And another very important part of the analysis has to do with looking at the 3 variables of design to seek evidence of the things that are working well or not in the region. Based on all of our reading and our own perspectives, we have come up with 3 design variables for a PPP and which define the successful design, defining functions and interfaces with the remaining actors in the institutional framework and in the operational process. By this, we mean the process of implementation, approval, and subsequent execution of the contract. A definition of interfaces then a location and structuring of the unit, and finally the resources. Defining functions. When you define a central unit, what you need to do is think about the design as a whole against the backdrop of the institutional framework, being clear as to the links with the authority that grants the concessions. And when we talk about coordination, we are looking at a cycle for approvals or reviews prior to approval. And here there are two different levels. We need to ensure the coordination and see if it's going to be integrated into just one entity that will take care of the approval, or will we have committees, which is another option, but this requires a secretariat, an office, and that is a possible function for a central PPP unit with a transformative orientation. How many minutes do I have left? 4. I'm doing great. So Proesa and the general PPP office in Paraguay are two good examples of this secretariat or single window, so as to then transfer the file to the approving committee. Sometimes there might be failings in coordination, but we can look at such things as the location where it is actually residing, and also there might be things such as a secondment arrangement. Also, the idea of having a certain ministry as the overarching entity. There are cases such as the Ministry of Public Works in Chile. Mostly we are looking at a central unit, and the prevailing aspect is finance, or the prevailing department is the finance ministry, which is quite common internationally. But often this is also linked to the president's office, but very often, again, as I said, to finance, the case in Europe. And the creation may be by means of a law, ideally, or it may be an organizational chart that provides for the creation of a unit. And then, of course, we need the funding, the sufficient and quality resources. And there's a risk, we have seen this in some countries we looked at, in terms of a low independence ratio. What I mean is, when the team is mainly staffed with consultants rather than staff, this creates an external dependence and a non-consolidation or lasting body of knowledge within the organization. Then another point is something we pointed out in the report, especially with regard to the preparation phase of the project, the use of development funds. There are also some other considerations. For instance, when a PPP may perhaps be involved in conflicts of interest or disincentives with regard to the entities that take care of the contracts. I hope this more or less helps and provides some ideas for recommendations, which, by the way, what are the recommendations and takeaways of our papers? So there's a set of recommendations and considerations and takeaways that I would suggest point to satisfactory developments in the region, but with room for improvement. But we need a framework review. We need to ensure the authority and relevance of the central unit, a good fit with regard to the place where the unit will be established. It may be anywhere. It doesn't matter where. The important thing is for it to be relevant. We need to have the best possible coordination with regard to the approvals process, and we must concentrate functions. That is sacred. After that, there are issues that do not require changes in the institutional framework. And of course, there's room for improvement in all cases in the region here. We need to pay a lot more attention to the training function of the central unit, guarantee the sufficiency of funds, both for the unit and to ensure its independence, regardless of fees. And also, there must be funds for the preparation processes, and there must be a clear strategy in place for management of talent and resources.
So within the agencies, and the agencies, when they include departments and divisions, you need to have the management of talent and human resources. That includes training. You have to have career professional development plans, and also establish timelines, and also develop systems of evaluation, performance evaluations with these units related to quality assurance from the perspective of, again, quality assurance, where we propose in the paper a brief survey or questionnaires in order to conduct a self-evaluation of the performance levels of the system and also of the quality assurance process. So this can be a step-by-step focus on creating a quality assurance unit and be able to implement it appropriately. And with that, I'll offer the floor to Daniel. Thank you, Andres. So let's get into the Q&A session now. Let's begin with Catherine. Catherine, we see that in Colombia, there are various entities that could create PPP programs like FONAD and INDETER, and you also have the Ministry of Finance that participates in the approval of projects process, and they conduct periodic follow-ups based on the contingents. And then you also have the transportation sector. You have the Ministry of Health that also manage these contracts. So what is the role of the unit within the PPPs, and how can it reinforce the process? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for those questions. I think they're very, very specific. Now, regarding the first item that you mentioned, what is the role of the PPP unit in Colombia in terms of project approval? I would just like to share with you this slide so that you can start to identify the role played by the PPPs in this. Well, we support all of the prior phase that analyzes projects, where this is an instrument that was created by a resolution. We look at all of the conditions that could be a part of the process. Subsequently, in phase 2, we undergo all of the necessary steps for the approval process to be able to demonstrate the effectiveness and the efficiency within the economy. And then we also look at the registry of public-private partnerships. It's established by law that has oversight over all of the national and international programs. That's the prior phase. During the approval phase, project approval phase, we conduct an analysis where we justify the contract through a tool that was implemented nationally for the PPPs. So we look, again, we have the prior phase, the quality assurance phase, as Andres was already referring to, and we also play a role working together with the Ministry of looking at the various sectoral positions in the medium term and in the expenditures context. So then we participate in, first of all, in the development of public policies, working with the Ministry of Finance, and we also have a special focus on, well, we have worked with training programs. The public, we have been involved in training with 190 entities. We also have virtual courses dealing with PPP. We work together with the IDB. We've held 5 training sessions so far, and approximately 450 officials have been trained. We know that it is a challenge to continue with the process but it is a special focus within the planning. And then looking at some of the challenges and strengths, these are things that we do have to improve on. Well, looking at our strengths, let me just illustrate it with this chart. So with PP, we are able to consolidate many of the PPP projects broken up into 5 areas: transfer of knowledge, building of public policies, the programs dealing with standards, and also the ex post initiatives that have been implemented in the country. Then we look at, we try to improve specific areas for private participation. So these are some of the strengths that we've identified in the country. We're able to consolidate in one PPP unit these strategic lines of effort. So what are some of the challenges that we've encountered? And I'm sure Andres would support me in that. The PPP efforts have not been institutionalized. They are within a part of a public entity that has all of the technical resources, the National Planning Agency, but the PPP historically, that unit since 1996, has been funded mainly with resources from the IDB, and we've not been able to be included within the organizational structure of the entity. And I would just like to add one other thing. I'm not sure how we're doing time-wise, but one very specific item. I think another national level challenge is to try to have that committee or interagency board or council that could play a leadership role. We're missing that in a decision-making process, where we believe that because of the characteristics of the PPP unit in terms of planning, we could serve as technical secretariat at this level, and then therefore we would be able to fine-tune and achieve that necessary effectiveness within the unit. And these are my 2 main considerations, Daniel. Well, thank you very much. And now I will move on to Maria Susana and the institutionality in Peru that, and I thought it's been a very interesting recommendation at the national level, in that I think it clearly delineates the various activities dealing with regulation and oversight. For example, a promoter of the investment processes, also working with contracting and among the agencies involved in regulation. You have CIPRAN, and you also have, again, focus on controlling fiscal resources. Could you just explain how is the PPP system structured in Peru, and what do you consider the strengths and opportunities of this system? Well, yes, good morning. First of all, I'd like to mention that in Peru, the PPP process is really within a national system that focuses on promoting private investment. It's been, in fact, created by legislation, and looking at standards and technical guidelines. The system is basically, it comprises of 4 actors that I will mention. So the Ministry of Finance is basically the guiding organization, the maximum authority, whose function is to articulate and guide the promotion of private sector involvement, and working with local entities who are basically the sponsors of the projects, and they participate in each and every phase of the PPP process. Another actor, which is an organization that promotes a private investment. We have 2 categories. We have local and regional government. At that level, we have OPI, which is a promoting entity, promotes private sector investment, and they are authorized to carry out these processes. However, the standards restrict the scales, in other words, to small and medium-sized scale. And then the national government, OPIP, that is tasked with larger projects, with larger investments. So that's the third actor within the system. And then finally, we have other public sector organizations that play a role at various phases. We have the regulatory agencies. We have SUNA, FINAMIN, and the Comptroller General of the nation. So these are the four actors that are involved in the process. And then in Peru, the various phases, PPP phases, are five. We start with planning and programming, where the sponsor, the sector, must include within the investment report the various projects that they envision implementing over the next 3 years in this case, and looking at their focus on developing the PPPs and justify that they also have the resources in order to implement these to their successful conclusion. And then we also look at and here we work quite a bit with the National Public Sector Investment Entity, the regulatory agency. These are dealing with co-financed or co-funded projects. And subsequently, this is then forwarded to the private sector investment entity. So this was something that was, I believe, included in the paper. Then the third phase would be the structuring, that is under the responsibility of Pro Inversión. In the case of national level projects, at this phase, what we do is that we will invest in the initial contracting, and then it's at this phase where we engage with the other actors to a lesser extent. For example, with the sector that is tasked and with a project and has to approve the contract with the regulatory agency, and then also with the Ministry of Finance. So all of the initial contracts, their initial versions, have to go through this approval process. This then will conclude and transition then to the subsequent phase where we have we consult. We have the various consultants that provide their inputs, and then we develop a final version. And then the actors that were involved previously, the sponsors of the project, the regulatory agency, and the Ministry of Finance. And then we also will receive input from the Comptroller General for those projects that involve public sector resources. And then finally, we have the various sectors involved with the contracting, and there are some conclusions that we can derive from these five phases. And that is, the national system promoting private investment is linked up with the system of public investment. So MEF participates in each one of these policy formulation processes, and OPIP allows us to then transition to the next phase. But Proinversión is really actively involved in two of the phases, and not all of the phases are headed by the same actor. First, the sector takes the lead, then at the execution of the contracts is implemented by EPT. So that's basically the framework governing PPPs. Now, in terms of strengths and opportunities for improvement, I think we have several strengths. And let me focus on four. For example, Proinversión is an entity that is very a sound institution. We're recognized, and it has very clear goals, and it is based on existing legislation. It interacts clearly with each actor that I've already mentioned, and it also has political support. The governing board of Pro Inversión includes 5 ministers that is headed by the Minister of Finance, and the others are representatives of other positions within the organization structure. So this is to make sure that assistance is provided by the sponsor. So it has autonomy, and it is specialized in specific the specific area with financial autonomy. Regarding opportunities for improvement, of course, there's always room for improvement, and based on the document that we've disseminated, I think this will show some of the areas that can be improved upon. There are, as you can already determine, there's a significant amount of coordination of efforts with other entities throughout the process. There are various entities that now this will at the same time lead to lengthier amount of time for the whole process to unfold. So there's several offices and agencies. Now perhaps what we need to do is have one focal point that not only brings together all of the inputs and comments but will also be involved in training the other agencies and offices and I think that's important because throughout the process, you need to train personnel from other offices, raise an awareness about the nature of the PPPs. So we need to continue our efforts to standardize processes. Proinversión is currently involved in developing a standard contract formats, and what it seeks is to reduce transactional costs as well as the interaction with other actors and entities, and that's really significant in order to enhance the approval process so this is something that would be discussed. And then finally, although I think we need to get the opinions and inputs from areas of specific jurisdictions, we also need to provide support in other areas and issue comments that perhaps sometimes pertain to other agencies' jurisdiction and authority. So that way, to do this, you need to discuss these matters with the other actors. Thank you very much. That's basically all I had. Well, thank you, Maria Susana. And now let's move on to Adilio, in Paraguay, we have the Ministry of Finance, the Technical Secretariat, and the Ministry of Public Works and Communications that are the main actors involved. And within each one of these, you have specialized teams or units, PPP units. So given the previous comments, we'd like to pose these questions. How are these PPP units structured? Then the second question is, what exists in the new resolution that would give your unit under your responsibility a new responsibilities? And could you delve a little bit more into these new responsibilities? Thank you, Daniel, for those questions. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes, Adilio, we hear you. Well, thank you. So just to begin, I would just ask the organizers if we could please share slide 4 of Andres's presentation. Maria Susana, could you remove your presentation? I'll upload it. All right, suit yourself. All right, I will be doing that. So contracting agency, given the relevance, well, which in this case would be the Ministry of Public Works in Paraguay, and you have the Office of Strategic Projects, a sub-agency which serves as basically a driver in terms of infrastructure, and they also have a well-developed technical team. And as Andres was already mentioning in the paper, they have the staff and independence in order to continue implementing this. They generate public sector investment, and although we also have the technical planning agency under the Office of PPPs, that by having, and thank you, since this serves as a one-stop shop for the national public investment process. So this is a natural link between the PPPs and public sector investments. We've already discussed some of the details. This is an analysis of and these are the projects that are also, and then this step, we see a quality control process in terms of, and including several indicators. And after this evaluation, then the Ministry of Finance under the Subsecretariat of the public sector agency, you have a department that is involved in all of the areas that pertain to the Ministry of Finance. Now, just one proviso. The Ministry of Finance is usually involved in this, and on the basis of this, in this department, the PPP department is also involved in the fiscal analyses, working with the Office of Planning and Projects. Getting back to the PPP General Office, or as I was saying, on the one hand, we have the Office of Analysis of Public Works that can provide significant support to sectoral plans and policy formulation. Now, when we look at the management of knowledge and skills, this was launched a few years ago, but now I think it needs to be revamped. And fortunately, we're also working closely with the IDB in terms of training and planning, that we are now resuming the efforts, and we're hoping to provide internal training facilities for our human resources. And also, we would also like to have a training provided for our potential clients that would be involved in the PPP processes. Let me just mention that the technical staff, both public investment staff and the PPP personnel, can also train colleagues from other agencies. And it's also important to mention, looking at some of the specific coordinating functions, that legislation 5112 that was passed in 2014 assigns coordinating efforts to the PPP agency. So in that regard, I think we are pretty well aligned with the recommendations already mentioned by Andres. So I think this will provide the context. Getting back to the first question, I don't know if that answers the question. I think you clarified this very well. Thank you. Let me just add, regarding the question, I have been in this position for about the last 3 months. I worked in the Ministry of Finance with the PPPs for about 10 years, and drawing on that experience and the lessons learned, comments and inputs regarding, the year before, with the legislation, that there was a new PPP legislation passed, which focuses on improving for example, project management aspects. For example, looking at the mandatory approval processes, and it also looks at some of the the reduction in terms of the steps that are necessary to take, the transactions, and in the process, it gets back to the roles already established in legislation 5112, focused on coordination of efforts, promoting and training, instead of the way it had been established earlier, where it was basically diverted from the Ministry of Finance. And as Andres indicated, we now play a role of advising on some of these projects. So looking at the new resolution and by intensifying the roles established in the legislation, we're able to move forward in formulating projects with the support of the Public Investment Agency, as well as other institutions and agencies. I can continue for hours. I could actually go on for months if you want. Well, thank you very much, Adilio. Now let's move on to Sigmund. Sigmund, the PPP program in the Dominican Republic has just barely been launched. And during the previous administration, when the PPP legislation was passed in February 2020, and also this came with accompanying handbooks and guides. So I think the legislation is fairly enlightening in terms of the way it encourages PPP projects. Could you just tell us what are the government agencies that are involved throughout the process of development? And what about the applicable regulatory framework with various agencies involved? And then my second question is, from your perspective, what are some of the risks involved when the PPP project process unfolds and governmental institutions sometimes do not carry out their responsibilities, or we don't see a full commitment by all of the entities involved? Well, thank you, Daniel, and greetings to everyone. Well, we are, I think we're the rookies here. As you've already indicated, we've only been in existence for about a year after the passing of the PPP legislation in February of last year. So we basically have been involved over the last 6 months in structuring our entity, the PPP entity, which focuses on structuring, promoting, and also having oversight of the PPP process. So we're basically at a learning stage where we're trying to glean experiences and lessons learned. So we're really learning as we move along with the implementation and also the recent regulations and standards, the legislation, the methodologies that have already been passed and approved. So we're basically, as we move along, we're looking, and we're also involved in the structuring and analyses of the PPP. And these are being analyzed at our agency, working with both the public and private sector initiatives. So since we have an agency that was created in the middle of a pandemic, we've needed to leverage what we would call, well, basically a very active role of the private sector. The private sector entities apparently had been waiting for many years for this to happen. In fact, they had a lot of projects in the pipeline that have either promoted or have already been implemented with the office. The office has a national PPP board that is, in fact, is one of the few agencies, as Andres already indicated, that are a part of the executive with them, and this includes the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Development. We also have engagement by the Ministry of Justice, and also a legal advisor to the president, and also the director of procurements. That was created specifically in order to have oversight on contracting and procurement of government services and resources. So this has been included now in the board in order to ensure that this figure and this individual participate actively in the competitive bidding process and selection. Prior to this process, the role was fairly passive with voice, but without a vote. So looking at the new structure, we have a very robust structure comprised of ministries that probably are considered to have the most relevance in public policy formulation. That includes the executive and also the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Planning and Economy. So these authorities, they also play an active role in all of the structuring processes. And specifically, the Ministry of Finance and Economics, we have, according to our regulatory structure, we have the evaluation entities, all of the projects, the PPP projects, whether they are focused on private or public initiatives. One of these is just headed by and executed by the agency specifically. In other words, the eligibility uh, uh, issues where we identified for example, the feasibility of the projects and are they relevant and consistent with the PPP structure. But looking at social impact in our countries, this involves us, well, it includes the Ministry of Planning and Finance and the Treasury.
So before a PPP project is declared to be in the public interest, in other words, formally recognized by the government, we must go through these hoops, which means that the role of these institutions is extremely important before the declaration of public interest. So the law has ordered the creation at each ministry of an executing unit for PPPs. So there's not just our agency as the oversight body, but also at each ministry there must be a permanent unit to provide ongoing support for these processes and analyses we have already referred to. But the Ministry of Economy and Planning takes part in the process of inclusion of the PPP projects in the register. Before any tender, the projects must be registered with the relevant agency, and this registry is kept by the Ministry of Economy, Planning and Development, which must ensure that the project is consistent with the general public investment guidelines delineated by the state every year or every 2 years or every 4 years. And once that has been done, we move on to the opening of the tender so that any potential bidder may become involved. And moving on to your second question, the authorities that are offering the contract are very important. Depending on the type of project, we will have the most relevant authority involved. The Ministry of Public Works, the port authorities or airport authority, the Ministry of Energy, each one of which will play a twofold role. If these are private initiative projects, then we formally receive the project and we invite the authority to support us in the pre-feasibility and feasibility study once the project has been declared to be in the public interest. If the project stems from a public initiative, the role of the contract awarding authority is that of structuring the project. In the last 6 months, we've had to offer a lot of support to the authorities offering the contract, because many of these authorities don't have much expertise with regard to PPPs. So our general office also provides advice, support and consultancy so that the individual entities, the procuring entities, may actually act in conformity with the law. And once the formal process has begun and the project is awarded, the procuring authority executes the public-private partnership with the private that has been awarded the contract. And then there's also the oversight authority and role. So we supervise the PPP contract, but the procuring entity also oversees and supervises the project itself. If it's related to infrastructure, it will supervise the proper execution in accordance with the contract, will ensure that the execution and maintenance takes place efficiently pursuant to the contract, and ensures that throughout its whole life cycle, the project will be effective and in keeping with the contract. And our general office will exercise an oversight role to ensure that the contract runs according to the legal and financial provisions that apply to the whole life of the PPP project. Thank you very much, Sigmund. This concludes this panel. Thank you for participating in this very enlightening project, Maria Susana, Catherine, Adilio, and Andres. We'll move on to our next panel, moderated by my friend Mario Cicada. Thank you very much.